You said something I want to follow up on. When you talked about the selection process for the documentary nomination, you referred to it as the selection committee as being conservative. I don't know if you meant that politically or kind of culturally. In other words,
well, no, I really didn't mean politically. I meant in terms of being purists, in terms of what you said about liking rather straight documentaries. I think a lot of people feel, documentary-wise, that when you sit and watch a documentary, that the documentary filmmaker owes the audience a certain amount of trust, that what is going to be on the screen is completely true. You can be Oliver Stone and do the story of Ron Kovic and mess a little bit with Kovic's life in terms of what happened. And it's okay because you're working with actors and you're fictionalizing the story, and I think people know that because there have been a lot of biographical films that have been, that have tinkered with the lives of their subjects. But when you do a documentary, and I think you're working with a different standard. And I think, for example, if Michael would have, there are two things he could have done. He could have made a really straight documentary, which he didn't want to do, which really wouldn't have been very entertaining. And I can understand why he wouldn't want to do that. And it's real easy for me to talk in hindsight, of course, so you can take what I say with a grain of salt. But, if he'd have had some kind of disclaimer at the beginning, maybe even just some kind of witty thing like, this is my story, it may not be exactly...
if he had just said something like a personal viewpoint or
something. I think so. And I don't think that would have detracted from the entertainment value of the movie. And I think, as I say, it's real easy to talk in hindsight, but I think a lot of the concerns people had could have been short-circuited by doing something like that. Because people could say, well, look, it's his viewpoint, and he can say what he wants.
It's interesting because he didn't come out and put the label documentary on it. He just made a movie, and people outside of the process of making the film said, oh, this is a documentary. And he was judged by those criteria, when in fact, one could say he was making What's Up, Tiger Lily, only, a different style.
Yeah, he's called it a mockumentary, and he was calling it that even before it was shown at all these film festivals to all this acclaim. But there was no indication, really, that the movie was anything but a documentary. I mean, it was kind of implied because Michael's a real person, Roger Smith's a real person, there were real people in the movie, no one was acting from a script. And I think critics looked at it, especially critics who weren't familiar with Flint or maybe with the GM situation, and thought, well, it's a documentary. And in many ways it was, but it certainly was not a traditional documentary. So, I guess in that regard, I'm not that surprised it wasn't nominated as Best Documentary, because it wasn't exactly a documentary, even though that's probably the closest thing to what it was.
I thought the timing was very interesting. You alluded to it before when you said if the nominations had been earlier, he probably would have gotten the nomination, but because it was when it was. And I thought of it, I guess one gets a little suspicious after a while, after a few years of watching the process politically. What struck me was the timing of the counterattack on Roger and me. It was, I mean, it's very much of an orchestrated counterattack. It's perfectly legitimate. The promotion was an orchestrated promotion, too. But what struck me was that the counterattack on that film was launched literally almost to the day to influence the Oscar process. In other words, as the committee was sitting down, the New York Times was writing its article that the counterattack against Roger and me, which was legitimate. I don't think the counterattack was phony, but the timing of it was very interesting. Just at the right time to sort of get maximum impact to discourage a nomination and discourage the selection by the Academy.
Well, I don't think the criticism, and I guess I can speak for the Journal. It's not designed to promote or not promote it for a nomination. There was criticism of the film as early as last fall, but it is true that GM attempted to force certain programs that Michael was on to that they'd pull their ads. That's the truth, and there's no question about that. I'm not sure that the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times really orchestrated anything. I think the natural time to do a story on an Oscar contender is when it's a contender, and I think that's kind of a natural thing.
But like, for example, what the Journal did. The Journal, I mean, dealt with it right from the start, and the Journal was dealing with it as a hometown story, and dealt with, the sort of the pros and cons of the issue months and months before the Oscar was even a contender. When was it Pauline Kael that sort of had the major?
Well, there was an article in Film Comment magazine that came out in November, I think. Obviously, the Journal's not read as widely as Film Comment or Pauline Kael, who writes for the New Yorker. And yeah, I think a lot of other media looked at the film after those, after the Kael review and after the Film Comment story. So I guess that's when a lot of the criticism of the movie began.